The wind cut like a knife through the canyon, hissing over stone and snow, sweeping away the last echoes of screams. The world was white except where the blood had thawed the ground in patches, freezing black under the moon. Nalina staggered across it, bare feet raw and broken, her husband's necklace clutched in one hand. The silver beads were cracked where a boot heel had ground them into the dirt. She pressed them to her lips as if they still held warmth. Nothing did. Her tribe was gone, the soldiers had taken what they pleased and left fire in their wake, and the snow covered the rest. She moved without direction, hunger hollowing her, grief twisting her shoulders forward until she looked more spirit than woman. Wolves had been trailing her since dusk, their shapes flickering in and out of the timberline, their yellow eyes catching the faint light. She welcomed them at first. Better to be torn apart quickly than to walk another night carrying silence where voices once were. But when one came too near, she lifted a rock and hurled it with a cracked cry that startled even herself. The wolf backed away, snarling, and she wept with the sudden knowledge that some part of her still wanted to live. The storm thickened, flakes heavy, muffling the world. She fell once, then again, and when she rose the second time her legs gave way. She crawled to a dead log and slumped beside it, chest heaving. Her lips formed the words of an old song, but the tune broke halfway through. She dropped her head to her knees. Boots crunched in the snow behind her. At first she thought it was the wolves made bold, but then a shadow separated from the dark. A man stood there, tall and broad, his coat stitched from hides, rifle slung across his back. His beard was frosted white, his face lined deep with years of cold and solitude. He watched her without moving. The weight of his silence pressed heavier than the snow. Her cracked voice rasped, "I have no tribe left." The words hung there like smoke, fragile and bitter. She expected him to turn away. Men had done worse to her than that. Instead he stepped closer. His hand went to the knife at his belt, not to draw but to touch it, as if deciding which choice left him the lighter burden. The wolves howled from the ridge. He glanced up, then back to her. "If you stay here," he said, voice low, graveled with disuse, "you'll freeze." She lifted her chin, though it trembled. "Then let it be so." The man looked at her for a long while, as though measuring the truth of what she said against the snow piling on her shoulders. His gaze shifted to the beads in her hand, then to her blistered feet. He swore under his breath, soft and resigned, and reached down. She flinched as he offered his arm. "You come," he muttered, "or you die here. Choice is yours." It was not kindness in his tone but necessity, the voice of a man accustomed to lonely bargains. She stared at him, torn between pride and the raw ache of survival. Then she slid her hand into his rough palm. His grip was strong enough to lift her to her feet with one motion. They walked in silence, his stride steady, hers faltering. He did not speak when she stumbled. He simply caught her elbow and kept moving. The snow deepened until it swallowed their knees. His breath came in clouds that mingled with hers, the only proof she had that he was not another ghost of the canyon. At last the cabin appeared, crouched beneath the pines like an animal in hiding. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin line vanishing into the storm. The man pushed open the door and guided her inside. The heat struck her like a blow. She sagged against the wall, blinking at the sudden flicker of fire. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and old leather. Tools hung neatly on the walls, traps stacked by the door. A table scarred with years of use stood beside a stove where a pot hissed faintly. The man pulled off his gloves and tossed them onto a chair. "Sit," he said, pointing toward the fire. She obeyed, lowering herself onto a bearskin rug. The flames painted her skin in shifting gold, but she still shivered as though the cold clung to her bones. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank in small sips, each one painful against her cracked lips. "Name?" he asked finally. "Nalina." He nodded once. "Jedediah Kane." The name felt heavy like stone. She tucked it away. He crouched by the fire, feeding it a log, and sparks leapt up the chimney. The ember grew into steady flame. She watched it until her eyes burned. It reminded her of the campfires of her people, of voices lifted in song. She bit her lip hard to keep from crying out. Jedediah did not look at her as he spoke again. "You can stay till the storm breaks. After that, we'll see." She bowed her head. The words were more mercy than she expected, yet they carried no promise. She whispered to the fire in her own tongue, words for the dead. He did not interrupt. Night settled heavy over the cabin. The wind rattled the shutters and the wolves' howls stretched long across the valley. Inside, the fire threw shadows on the walls, twisting and reaching like restless spirits. Nalina curled near it, her body aching with exhaustion. She glanced at Jedediah, who sat sharpening his knife in silence. His eyes were on the blade, but she felt his attention like weight on her skin. For the first time since the raid, she let her body rest. Sleep came uneven, full of jagged dreams, but still she slept. Jedediah stayed awake long after, the knife in his hand forgotten. He studied the woman wrapped in borrowed furs, her face drawn tight with grief even in slumber. He had not planned on anyone sharing his fire this winter, least of all an Apache widow with eyes like the last light on snow. But the storm outside was fierce, and the storm inside her fiercer still. He muttered to himself, rough and low, best not to keep her. Yet when the fire dimmed, he rose and laid another log across it, watching the flame leap high again. The glow touched her cheek, softening it. Wolves cried on the ridge but did not come down. The snow deepened, sealing the cabin from the world. In that silence, two strangers remained, one stripped of her tribe, the other stripped of everything long ago, bound now by a single ember burning in the dark. The storm did not break for 3 days. Snow climbed the windows until the cabin seemed buried alive, and the sound of wind became a steady roar in the pines. Nalina spent the hours by the fire, her body mending though her spirit still bent low. Jedediah Kane moved about the one-room dwelling in silence, sharpening traps, stitching leather, cutting strips of meat to hang over the stove. He spoke little, and when he did it was in clipped words that gave no space for conversation. On the second morning she tried to stir the pot that hissed on the stove. She wanted to be useful, to prove she was not only another mouth to feed. But when she lifted the lid too quickly, steam scalded her wrist and the broth spilled across the floorboards. Jedediah turned from the workbench. His eyes narrowed, but instead of anger he crouched, mopped the mess with a rag and muttered, "Slow hands." The words were neither cruel nor gentle, but she heard patience beneath them. She kept her eyes low, ashamed that her hands shook like a child's. When the snow eased enough for him to step outside, he took her with him. The world was white, endless, broken only by the black reach of timber and the hard gray shoulders of the mountains. She wrapped herself in his old shawl, the wool worn thin but warm, and tried to follow where his boots pressed deep. He showed her how to set a rabbit snare, how to read the faint lines of tracks beneath fresh powder. Her fingers fumbled with the cord, and when she broke the knot he took it from her without scold, tied it neat, then placed it back in her hands. "Try again," he said simply. She did, though the rope slipped more than once. That evening, as the fire crackled, she dared to hum under her breath, an old lullaby little more than a whisper. Jedediah paused from oiling his rifle. He did not comment, but he listened until she grew too self-conscious and fell silent. She saw the faintest shift in his gaze, like the memory of something long buried. By the week's end the snow thawed enough for them to travel to the trader's post at the edge of the valley. Nalina kept close to Jedediah as they entered, the room thick with tobacco smoke and stale whiskey. Men looked up from their tables, eyes lingering too long on her dark hair and copper skin. One spat into the sawdust and muttered, "Savage widow clinging to a white man's coat." Another laughed sharp and cruel. Heat flamed across her cheeks, and she shrank behind Jedediah's broad frame. He did not raise his voice, did not strike or curse. He simply stood there, shoulders square, his stillness heavier than any threat. The laughter died. The trader hurried to fetch the supplies without another word. Nalina followed him out into the biting cold, her throat tight with shame. Back on the trail, she whispered in Apache, words too soft for him to know, "Thank you for seeing me." He did not understand the tongue, but he glanced at her, puzzled, as if he felt the weight of her gratitude despite the barrier of language. Night stretched long in the valley. The wind carried voices that were not there, and more than once Nalina woke with tears burning her cheeks. She told Jedediah once as they stacked wood, "I hear him in the dark. My husband. The soldier's fire has not taken his voice from me." She expected him to dismiss it, perhaps mock her grief. Instead he only kept splitting logs, each swing of the axe sharp and steady. "Best you listen," he said. "The dead got lessons the living forget." One evening a storm rose sudden, thick snow swallowing the world outside. The wolves came close, their howls pressing against the shutters. Jedediah loaded his rifle, set it by the door, and returned to the fire. She could not sleep. She sat watching him sharpen his knife, sparks glinting along the steel. The rhythm of the blade against stone steadied her heartbeat more than any lullaby. At dawn they found tracks near the cabin, wolf prints circling like a warning. She bent to study them, and for the first time Jedediah's voice carried a thread of respect. "Good eye." Her heart lifted, fragile but alive. Still, shame followed her like a shadow. She tried to mend one of his torn shirts, pricking her fingers until blood marked the cloth. When she showed him the uneven stitches, bracing for reproach, he only shrugged. A shirt keeps cold out, don't need to be pretty. She met his eyes, and in the firelight she saw not judgment but a kind of weary acceptance. The days bled together, a rhythm of work and silence. She fetched water from the frozen creek, hauled wood, set traps that caught nothing. Each failure cut her pride, but Jedediah's calm steadied her. He was a man carved from mountains, slow to speak, slower still to anger. The longer she stayed, the more she saw the small mercies behind his quiet. He always left the warmest spot by the fire for her. He never let her carry more than she could bear. When the wind found its way through the shutters, he rose in the night to fix them while she slept. Word spread beyond the valley. At the post, whispers followed them like smoke. Some pitied her, some scorned him for harboring a widow of the Apache. Jedediah bore it all in silence, but Nalina felt each whisper like a lash. Late one night she stood at the door, staring at the snowfield stretching silver under the moon. "I should go," she murmured. "Your people do not want me here." Jedediah came to stand beside her. He did not look at her, only at the ridges rising dark against the stars. "Ain't no people of mine left," he said. "Only this mountain." His words sank into her bones, a strange comfort. She realized then that he too carried exile. His tribe was solitude, his kin the ridges and storms. The fire snapped behind them, casting their shadows long across the floor. She turned back, knelt near the flames and fetted another log. The embers glowed brighter, steady as a heartbeat. She stared at them, the warmth reaching her face, and felt a fragile stirring deep inside. Not joy, not yet, but the faintest spark of belonging. Outside, the wolves prowled, their cries sharp against the night. Inside, the two of them sat in silence, bound not by words but by the fire that refused to die. The thaw came slow, breaking the valley open in patches where dark earth showed through the snow. Nalina carried water from the creek, her shawl pulled tight, watching the sky where hawks circled. She had begun to walk with steadier steps, no longer flinching at every shadow, though the grief never left her eyes. Jedediah noticed, though he said nothing. His silence was not indifference. It was a watchful thing, as if he waited to see what shape she would take in this new life. It was near sundown when riders came up the ridge, their silhouettes black against the pale sky. 3 men, one dressed finer than the others, coat trimmed with fur, hat pressed sharp. He bore the look of a man who thought himself master of the land he surveyed. Behind him trailed 2 rougher sorts with rifles slung careless. They reined up at the edge of the clearing, boots crunching as they dismounted. The fine one smiled without warmth. "Jedediah Kane. Heard tell you're squattin' in this valley still. Seems a pity holdin' prime land from men who can put it to better use." His eyes slid to Nalina, lingering too long. "And I see you've taken to keepin' company." Jedediah stood in the doorway, one hand resting easy on the frame. "This land's mine as much as any man's. Ain't for sale." The man's smile sharpened. "Name's Cyrus Finch. I'm authorized by the railroad to purchase or clear holdings that stand in the way of progress. You'd be wise to step aside." He looked again at Nalina, his voice thick with disdain. "Best take your guest elsewhere. Folks don't take kindly to that kind." Nalina felt the heat of shame climb her throat, but before she could speak Jedediah's voice cut low and hard. "You'll ride off this ridge, Finch. I've no more to say." The threat hung heavy in the cold air. For a moment Finch measured him, then laughed softly. "We'll be back." He swung into his saddle, the others following. Their hooves drummed down the ridge until only the wind remained. That night Nalina sat by the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. "They will return," she said, voice trembling. "Men like that do not leave without taking." Jedediah set his rifle across his knees. "Then we'll meet 'em." She stared at him, anger and fear warring in her chest. "You would fight a whole world for land?" He looked at her then, eyes shadowed in the firelight. "Not just land. This is the only place the world's left me." His words sank into her like stones. She understood more than he knew. Exile bound them both. Still the fear gnawed at her. Days later the valley was thrown into panic. A boy from a neighboring homestead, Tom Carver, 8 years old, red scarf around his neck, had gone missing in the storm. His mother's cries carried down the ridge as men searched, lanterns swinging in the dark. Nalina heard the wail and rose at once, grabbing her shawl. Jedediah was already at the door with his rifle. They tracked into the timber, snow falling thick again. The men scattered, calling the boy's name, but their voices grew faint in the distance. Nalina knelt often, scanning the ground where the snow lay broken. Her eyes caught what others missed, a torn thread from a scarf, the faint drag of small boots. She called softly to Jedediah, and he followed her lead without question. They found the boy huddled beneath a fallen pine, lips blue, eyes half shut. Wolves circled at the edge of the clearing, yellow eyes gleaming. Jedediah raised his rifle, firing a shot into the air that scattered the pack for the moment. Nalina threw herself to the boy's side, lifting him against her breast. His breath was shallow, his body limp. She pressed her warmth into him, whispering old words of comfort, rocking as though he were her own lost child. Jedediah watched her, a flicker of something breaking through his hard calm. He touched her shoulder. "We need to move." Together they carried the boy back through the storm, her arms cradling him tight while Jedediah walked ahead, rifle ready. By the time they reached the Carver homestead, the lanterns burned low, and the mother's cry turned to a sob of relief as she gathered her son. Nalina stood aside, snow melting in her hair, exhaustion dragging at her limbs. Jedediah looked at her then, long and unguarded, as though seeing her for the first time not as a burden but as something solid and fierce. Back at the cabin she sat by the fire, hands raw from cold. Jedediah knelt beside her, unwrapping the shawl, examining her fingers. His touch was rough but careful, wrapping them in cloth. The fire crackled between them, its light steady. "You see me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not what I have lost." Jedediah's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on her hands. "I see a woman still standing." The words hung between them, heavier than any vow. For a long time they did not speak. The fire glowed, embers steady, throwing light on faces marked by years of loss yet edged now with something new, something unspoken, fragile but alive. Outside, the ridge loomed dark, the threat of Cyrus Finch still lingering like a storm on the horizon. But within the cabin, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It held the weight of shared trial, of respect earned in snow and shadow. The wind sharpened as winter deepened, scouring the ridges until the pines groaned beneath its weight. Jedediah Kane felt it in his bones, the kind of cold that foretold more than weather. Trouble always came in storms, and the silence of the valley felt too brittle to hold. Nalina sensed it as well. Each night she lingered by the fire, feeding it more wood than needed, as though she feared the darkness outside might smother its glow. The trouble came with torches. It was near midnight when hoofbeats broke the hush, muffled by snow yet heavy with intent. Jedediah rose from his cot, rifle in hand before the second beat. Nalina stood already at the shutter, her breath shallow. Outside, flames bobbed in the white like foxfire, half a dozen men, their shadows long across the drifts. At their head rode Cyrus Finch, his fur-trimmed coat bright against the dark, arrogance worn like armor. Jedediah's voice was steady, low. "They've come for the land." Nalina's grip tightened on the necklace she still carried. "And for me." The words were not fear but truth. She stepped away from the window and lifted her bow, the string old yet strong. Jedediah turned to her, the lines of his face harsh in firelight. "Best you run for the timber. I'll hold 'em." Her eyes met his, fierce with something that had grown between them over long nights and small mercies. "I will not run again. I've no tribe left but this." For a moment he hesitated. Then he nodded once, as though sealing a pact neither of them had spoken aloud. The first shot cracked against the cabin wall. Splinters flew. Finch's voice rose over the storm. "Kane, this valley belongs to the railroad. Hand it over and maybe we'll let the squaw walk free." Jedediah stepped to the door and flung it wide, the rifle braced against his shoulder. "This mountain bows to no man," he growled and fired. One torch-bearer fell, flame dropping into the snow where it hissed out. The ridge echoed with return fire. Bullets punched the logs, scattering sparks from the hearth. Nalina crouched low, her bow strung, eyes fixed on the shapes moving against the firelight. The fight raged close. Jedediah fired with grim precision, every shot deliberate, measured like the strokes of a hammer. Men cursed, shouted, pressed forward despite the storm. One broke from cover, rushing toward the cabin. Nalina loosed an arrow that found his shoulder, spinning him into the drift. She drew again without pause, her breath steady though her hands bled where the string cut them. Inside, the cabin shook with each impact. Smoke stung their eyes. Jedediah reloaded, his jaw clenched. "They'll burn us out if we stay penned." Nalina met his gaze, the fire reflecting in her dark eyes. "Then we meet them in the snow." Together they burst from the door, the storm swallowing them whole. Snow whipped across their faces, torches guttering in the wind. Jedediah moved like a shadow among pines, rifle cracking, dropping men one by one. Nalina circled wide, her shawl blending with the night, arrows flying silent and swift. The attackers faltered, unnerved by the ferocity of two who fought as though the mountain itself rose with them. Finch bellowed from his horse, rage stripping his voice. "Kill the squaw. Burn the cabin." The words struck Nalina like a lash, but instead of fear they fed the fire in her chest. She loosed an arrow that tore the torch from Finch's hand. The flames sputtered in the snow, leaving his sneer half hidden. He drew his pistol, eyes wild. Jedediah advanced, rifle raised, but Finch fired first. The shot grazed Jedediah's arm, spinning him sideways. Blood darkened his sleeve, yet he pressed forward, teeth gritted. Nalina cried out and ran toward him, loosing another arrow that clipped Finch's hat from his head. Snow swirled thick, wolves howling from the ridge as if the mountain itself bore witness. Finch raised his pistol again, but Jedediah's rifle roared first. The land agent toppled backward into the drift, his fine coat spreading like a broken wing. The remaining men faltered, curses turning to panic. With their leader down and the storm rising, they fled into the trees, torches scattering, their shouts swallowed by the wind. Silence fell, broken only by the wolf's cry and the crackle of the last dying torch. Jedediah lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Blood dripped from his sleeve, staining the snow dark. Nalina was at his side in an instant, catching his weight as his knees threatened to buckle. Her hands pressed to his wound, fierce and steady. "You'll not fall," she whispered, the words more vow than comfort. He looked at her then, eyes raw, stripped of all the walls solitude had built. "You're not alone anymore," he said. His voice was ragged, but the truth of it rang clear as a bell in the storm. Nalina opened her hand and pressed the broken necklace into his palm. The beads were cracked, but in his grip they seemed whole again. "Then neither are you," she answered. They stood together in the storm, the cabin behind them scarred but standing, its chimney still sending a thread of smoke into the night. The wolves lingered on the ridge, their eyes glinting, but they did not come closer. Nalina tightened her hold on Jedediah's arm as they turned back toward the fire waiting inside. Snow fell heavy, covering the tracks of those who had fled, sealing the valley in silence once more. Inside, the hearth still burned, its light spilling across the walls, steady and unyielding. The ember that once seemed so fragile now roared strong, defying storm and shadow alike. The mountain had not bowed, nor had they.